What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
They sat me down at the kitchen table like they were about to deliver a serious medical diagnosis, and Mom, with that soothing voice she saves for other people's kids, said that college just is not in the budget right now. And Dad nodded like a bobblehead who has already decided that the conversation is over, and I kept my mouth shut because I wanted to see how far they were willing to ride this train before it ran into a wall, since I had the acceptance letter, the merit offer, and the plan. That required nothing from them but a basic co-signature and a promise not to default on their own bills, which, considering I have never once asked for a luxury anything, felt like a pretty reasonable request. I did not cry, and I did not beg, because begging only teaches people how much they can get away with, so I asked for clarity instead. And Mom said timing is bad, and Dad said everybody is tightening belts, and then added that I am smart enough to figure out a different route, which would have sounded like a compliment if he had not already printed out my brother's itinerary to Europe that I noticed on the printer tray behind him, with hotels and flights and museum passes, all labeled paid in full. Because apparently self-development for him is a line item while my education is a luxury purchase, we can circle back to someday. 1 week later, they threw a little send-off for Jason, which is what happens when the golden child needs growth, and the house filled with relatives who love a winning narrative more than they love people. And I kept hearing versions of he is so driven and this will make him a man, while Mom floated around collecting compliments like airline miles, and Dad told anyone who would listen that experience is better than classroom theory, which sounded convenient given that my classroom supposedly does not exist, and I stood there holding a paper plate I did not want, thinking that I could swallow this and stay small, or I could stop auditioning for a family role that was never written for me. I slipped into my room, opened my laptop, and read my acceptance letter again, slowly, like a person who is memorizing a door code, and then I looked up community colleges, night classes, scholarship databases, and every miserable job that would let me clock in without asking who I am to anyone. Because if I am not in the budget, then I need a budget that has only my name in it. When the guests moved to the driveway for the photos and the toasts, I went to the family group chat and typed a sentence I had rolled around in my mouth for days, and I said that I am stepping back from family plans this year since my education is not in the budget. But Europe apparently is, and I wish Jason a safe trip and all the growth he can carry. And then I pinned my acceptance letter to the fridge with the magnet that used to hold my kindergarten handprint, and I walked back out to the gathering with my face calm and my spine straight, because if you are going to be invisible, you might as well be invisible on your own terms. Mom read the chat, blinked, and put her phone away like it had bitten her, and Dad mumbled that I should not make this about money, which is rich, and a cousin squeezed my shoulder like she thought I needed pity when what I needed was a clean exit. That night, after the house went quiet and the dishwasher hummed like a white flag, I packed the duffel that still smelled like high school gym, and I folded in the clothes that do not need ironing and the documents I have been collecting like a paranoid accountant. And I left a printed copy of my tuition plan on the kitchen table with a circle around the tiny line where a parent's signature would have turned a mountain into a curb, and under it I wrote the sentence they gave me, not in the budget. And then I put the magnet back on the fridge to hold nothing at all, because blank space sometimes tells the story better than words. I did not slam the door and I did not leave a speech, because if they did not want to hear me when I was still inside the house, they were not going to hear me after I walked out, and I took the bus to a friend's couch and slept badly and woke up mean and clear, which, in my world, is better than sleeping like a baby and waking up naive. In the morning, I blocked the family group chat, not out of rage but out of strategy, because you cannot climb a ladder while someone keeps shaking it, and I set up alerts for part-time openings, applied for a night shift at a warehouse, emailed the scholarship office about deadlines I could still meet, and told myself that I am allowed to choose myself even if it makes me the villain in their bedtime stories. When Jason texted a photo from his flight with a caption about new beginnings and growth, I did not answer, and when Mom tried calling twice without leaving a voicemail, I did not answer either. Because my first act of revenge was not a speech or a scene or a public takedown. My first act of revenge was absence, intentional and total. The kind of absence that forces people to stare at the space where you used to stand and wonder whether the budget was worth the cost. The morning after I left, I woke up on Maya's couch with a stiff neck and a kind of focus I had never managed under that roof. And while she made coffee and offered the kind of kindness that does not come with conditions or speeches, I opened my laptop and made a list that felt like a lifeline, because if my family would not fund the person I am, I would become the person who does, and I started with the boring steps nobody applauds, the job applications and the budget spreadsheet and the late night community college enrollment form that lets you chip away at a bigger goal without asking permission from people who do not want you to have one. I took the first warehouse shift that would hire me with 0 questions and the early morning counter shift at a coffee place that paid in tips and sore feet, and I learned to nap in 30-minute bursts between obligations because energy was a currency now. And I treated it like one, and when I could not afford textbooks, I borrowed them from the library and photographed the chapters on my phone like a patient thief who only steals from a broken system. When relatives asked Maya where I was and whether I had calmed down, she told them I was busy and safe, which was true and also none of their business, and when Mom left a voicemail with that soft tone she uses when she is about to sell a painful choice as wisdom, I let it sit, because I knew if I heard it I would end up justifying their decisions to comfort them, and I had done enough of that for one lifetime. I gathered proof of what the financial aid office calls parental refusal, the emails where they said education is not in the budget, the notes from a counselor who knew the whole history. And I sat with a woman in a small office who listened like a person who deals in reality for a living, and she explained the path to a dependency override in plain words, and I felt the smallest crack in the wall, not a miracle and not a rescue. Just a door that would open if I kept pushing, which I did, every day, even when my legs felt like wood and my brain had that fog that comes from living 2 days inside one calendar. On the nights I was too wired to sleep, I wrote scholarship essays with the blunt honesty of someone who no longer fears being called ungrateful, and I used their sentence like a lever, not in the budget, not as a sob story, but as a fact. Because facts are sturdy, and sturdy is what I needed, and I talked about work and grit, and the way you learn to study in the hum of a laundromat while your clothes spin, and I named the teachers who stayed late to check my drafts, and the managers who gave me extra hours when they saw that I showed up even when showing up felt like losing a fight. I made a small rule for myself that felt bigger than it looked: no late-night replies to family, no defending myself in group chats, no jumping when someone who never paid attention suddenly remembers you exist, and every time I honored that rule, my spine got a little stronger and my head got a little clearer. Word filtered back to me through a cousin that my parents were telling people I had decided college was not for me after all, and that I needed time to find myself, and I laughed in the way you laugh when there is no humor anywhere near the situation. Because the truth was so simple, and they kept building narratives to keep their own mirrors clean, and I kept thinking that if they wanted a daughter who folded, they should have invested in one, because the version they got was building a life brick by brick and would not apologize for the sound of it. The warehouse gave me steadier hours, the coffee shop moved me to morning lead, the override went through after a stack of documents and a meeting where I did not cry, and a semester later the aid package arrived with grants and work-study and a housing spot. And I took it without ceremony, because some victories feel best when only you hear them land. I made one more choice that tasted like revenge without any of the mess, and it was simple and clean. I listed my emergency contacts as Maya and a professor who had become a mentor. And I removed my parents from everything that would notify them about my life, because if I am outside their budget, they're outside my plans, and that felt less like punishment and more like alignment. And I slept that night for the first time in months, without waking to a phantom ringtone. Then, while I was on a break in the stockroom counting boxes and trying not to think about how long the path still looked, my phone buzzed with an email from a program I had applied to with no expectations and a lot of stubbornness. A selective internship with real pay, real mentorship, and a track straight into a field where nobody cares who bought your plane tickets, and I stood there staring at the screen until the text blurred, and I knew that if I told my family now they would take credit for my direction or play. The concerned parent card to get a seat at a table they tried to flip, so I closed the message, slipped the phone back into my pocket, finished the count, and walked back to the floor with a calm face and a secret that felt like a key in my fist. Which is exactly where I wanted it when I stepped outside after closing and finally opened the email all the way, because the first word was congratulations, and the last line was start date confirmed, and I realized I had just crossed a line I had been drawing in pencil for years, and tonight it was finally ink. News of Jason's grand tour traveled faster than any application result I had ever waited on. Because relatives who never remembered my birthday suddenly had time to forward his photos from plazas and nightclubs and tourist traps with captions about growth and culture and becoming a citizen of the world. And I stared at those images during 10-minute breaks behind the coffee counter while my shoes soaked up the kind of fatigue that makes you feel older than you are, and I kept thinking that for some people growth is a passport stamp and a caption, while for others it is a stack of clocked hours, a spreadsheet that barely balances, and the stubborn refusal to let the story end with the line they wrote for you. At the internship orientation, which was held in a room that smelled like dry erase markers and determination, my program lead, a woman named Erin Hart who looks at people the way a carpenter looks at wood grain, not judging, just assessing what can be built, handed me a project that most first-week interns would tiptoe around, a messy dataset with no documentation and a client who wanted answers yesterday, and instead of apologizing for being new, I said yes and asked for access. And she nodded once like a person placing a bet on a long shot and moved on, which felt like more faith than I had seen from my family in years and made me decide right then that I would not waste it. While I was learning the office coffee machine and pretending not to be intimidated by people who seemed to have been born with business cards in their pockets, the family narrative machine kept grinding. Because an aunt sent me a voice memo from a barbecue where Dad described me as taking time to figure things out and Mom added that I might go back to school when the timing is right, and it hit me that they would rather be seen as the calm, wise parents of a wandering daughter than as the people who prioritized a vacation disguised as education for their son over a degree their daughter had earned the hard way. So I did what I have learned to do when someone tries to hold the microphone over my life. I took my own. In the evenings after class, I worked that first assignment like it was a rented room I had to keep clean to keep my place in the building. I cleaned the data. I documented assumptions. I asked the grumpy engineer for the pipeline notes nobody wanted to read. And I turned in a draft with recommendations that were clear, polite, and impossible to ignore, and Erin sent a short reply that said this is solid, push it to the client, and in that moment the oxygen in my chest felt less borrowed and more earned. Jason's trip started shedding its polish around the same time, because even the friendliest algorithm cannot sand down a pattern forever, and the posts got thinner, and the tone got defensively philosophical. The way it does when someone realizes the bill for their growth is coming due, and a cousin whispered that the fancy internship he bragged about in Prague was a week of shadowing that he bailed on after 2 days, and I tried not to feel petty satisfaction. Because my goal is not his failure. My goal is my life, but I am human and I let myself notice the contrast for exactly 1 minute before I put my head back into the things I could control. The internship stipend, small but real, landed. The work-study hours were steady, and I moved from Maya's couch to a room with a door that locked and a window that stuck halfway open, which felt like a luxury cruise compared to the late bus rides and borrowed blankets of the first months, and every night before sleep I wrote 3 lines in a notebook, one about money, one about school, one about boundaries, because I needed to see progress even when it was small and boring and not something you post with a filter. Then a thing happened that felt like revenge without mess, and I did not plan it as revenge. I planned it as truth, which turned out to be more effective than any speech I could have delivered at a family dinner. Because the college communications office put out a call for short essays from students who had non-traditional paths, and I wrote a clean piece about what it looks like when you are told that college is not in the family budget and you decide to go anyway. And I did not use names and I did not smear anyone. I just described the facts and the work and the help from people who were not related to me but acted like family when it mattered, and I closed with a line I had earned the right to use. that my education was not in the family budget, but it stayed in mine, and the piece went up on the college site and the local paper picked it up, and then everything moved fast, not in the way of drama, but in the way of exposure. People my parents know started calling them with those careful voices folks use when they are trying to confirm a rumor without sounding like a gossip, asking whether the article was about me, whether everything was all right, whether they knew about my award nomination from the internship's partner foundation that had been mentioned at the end as a footnote I had tried to keep quiet until it was official. And my phone lit up with texts from Mom that started with "We need to talk" and shifted to "We are proud of you" and landed at "Why didn't you tell us?" And I ignored them all, because the point had never been to hurt them. The point had been to end the monopoly they held on my story, and that monopoly expired the moment other adults read a simple sentence and recognized themselves or their kids in it. Aaron called me into a small meeting room with glass walls and said that the foundation asked for my availability to discuss the nomination and potential travel if I am selected, and she asked whether I had any conflicts she should know about. And I said I am free and fully committed, which was true in a deeper sense than she knew, and she smiled in that way people smile when they have watched you build something from scraps and decide not to be humble about it, and then my phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number that started with "Congratulations" and continued with details I read twice to make sure I had not imagined them, and I looked up at Aaron and said I think I just got invited to something big. And she said then we had better make sure you have what you need, and while she was talking through logistics, another call came in from a familiar area code, and I let it ring, because my next move was not a conversation. It was a choice about who gets a seat when the next door opens, and as the call went to voicemail, I opened a new email, typed a name that had nothing to do with my family, and wrote "Yes, I accept." By the time 4 years had passed, the frantic juggling of shifts, classes, and unpaid favors had shaped itself into something solid, not glamorous and not easy, but unshakable. And when the letter arrived inviting me to an award ceremony that would capstone my degree with honors, I read it twice before I let myself breathe, because part of me had never fully believed that the plan I drew up on that couch in Maya's apartment would ever actually deliver me here. The invitation was printed on heavy paper, the kind that feels like it belongs to people whose parents cheer in the front row, but mine carried a footnote that said each honoree could name only 2 guests for admission. And I knew before I even set it down that this rule was my shield, because I had no intention of placing my parents' names on that line, not after every voicemail they had left in the last few months suddenly painting themselves as misunderstood supporters who just wanted what was best. The names I wrote instead were Aaron, my mentor who had pulled me into rooms I never imagined myself in, and Maya, who had given me a couch, a kitchen table, and a reminder that family can be chosen. Meanwhile, the stories about Jason had shifted from glossy postcards to cautionary murmurs, because by then he had blown through 2 internships, one in Berlin and another in Milan, without finishing either. And he had returned to the States with an empty resume padded with photos, but no skills, moving back into my parents' house where he spent his time explaining how misunderstood he was by every employer who had apparently failed to see his genius. My parents, still clinging to the golden child myth, told people he was taking time to realign and figuring out his true direction, but relatives who had eyes and ears knew the truth. And the contrast between his decline and my steady climb was not lost on anyone, least of all me, though I said nothing, because silence was proving to be more cutting than any speech I could deliver. On the week of the ceremony, I started receiving texts that felt less like questions and more like demands, messages from Mom about how this was a family milestone, from Dad about how no matter what happened in the past we are still your parents, and from Jason who called me ungrateful and dramatic in the same sentence where he asked for extra tickets because he had friends who wanted to support me, and I let every one of them sit unread until they disappeared into the backlog, because if I had learned anything over these years it was that not every message deserves a reply, and sometimes the lack of one is the loudest answer of all. I spent those days focused on the speech I would give, careful not to let it slide into bitterness, but equally determined that it would not sanitize the truth. It had to be clean, it had to be sharp. And above all, it had to reflect that the people who stood with me when I had nothing were the ones who deserved the acknowledgement when I finally stood in the light. The night of the event, I walked into the hall with Aaron on one side and Maya on the other, and I felt the weight of 4 years of exhaustion shed itself with every step toward the rows of seats reserved for honorees. I spotted familiar faces, professors, colleagues, even a scholarship officer who had once stayed late to walk me through a form I thought I had ruined, and they waved with genuine pride, the kind that cannot be faked. Just before the ceremony began, a ripple of commotion stirred near the front doors, and someone leaned over to whisper that there were 2 people outside asking to be let in without an invitation, claiming to be the parents of an award recipient. I did not need to ask who, and I did not need to turn around to confirm, because my chest already knew the truth. My parents had shown up uninvited, dressed no doubt for photographs they would never take, standing outside glass doors they could not cross because their names had never been written on the list. As the lights dimmed and the program began, I pictured them out there, maybe pleading with the event staff, maybe crying because they suddenly realized that the budget excuse they used years ago had bought them a place on the sidewalk tonight. And I let that image settle into my bones, not as triumph in the petty sense, but as balance, as proof that choices have weight, and sometimes that weight falls when the spotlight is brightest. I rose when my name was called, walked to the stage without once looking back toward the doors, and felt the applause rise around me from strangers who knew only the version of me that had fought, endured, and earned her way here. And that sound alone was enough to confirm that I had chosen correctly. The speech I delivered was measured, deliberate, and precise. I thanked the professors who answered late-night emails, the mentors who took risks on me when my resume was thin, the friends who shared couches, meals, and faith, and the communities that had proven that support is not a blood right but a human choice. I did not mention my parents, not once, because leaving their names unsaid was the kind of revenge that requires no explanation, and as I looked out over the audience and saw Maya's proud smile and Aaron's quiet nod, I knew that silence had delivered more justice than anger ever could. When I stepped down from the stage and the music swelled, I caught sight of the closed doors at the back, the faint shadow of figures outside, and I turned my face forward again because my story had moved past that threshold, and they were the ones left waiting on the other side. When the applause settled and the lights rose and people began doing that happy shuffle that happens when a room has witnessed something clean and earned, I stepped off the stage with my speech still warm in my hands and felt Aaron squeeze my shoulder and Maya pull me into a hug that said everything without using a single grand word. And then an usher approached with the careful expression of someone carrying a small bomb and said, "There are 2 people outside who say they are your parents and they're crying and asking if you will come out for a moment." And I took a breath that was not shaky for the first time in years and said, "Please give them this envelope and tell them I am not available tonight." I had packed that envelope the way you pack a go bag, not to hurt anyone but to make sure I would not be tempted into a scene. And inside, I had placed a photocopy of the first acceptance letter with the tiny line where a parent's signature would have turned months of wrestling into one clean step, and under it I had taped the refrigerator magnet that used to hold my kindergarten handprint, and on a single sheet I had written a short note that said, "I will not perform gratitude for people who only show up for the photo. And if you want to see me invest in family, then put your money where your stories are and contribute to the fund below, because I launched the Not in the Budget scholarship this morning with my stipend, my award honorarium, and 2 matching donors who know what it is to hear no and go anyway." I did not wait to see if they read it or tore it or cried harder, because the point of the envelope was not theater, it was boundary. And while the staff handled the doors, I walked with Aaron and Maya to the small reception room where the foundation board was gathering the honorees, and I listened as people I had only known as email signatures introduced themselves like neighbors. And when the director announced that my project would receive a fellowship extension with real funding and a senior mentor and a seat at a table that had once felt like a myth, I let myself feel both parts of the truth at once, the part where I had made it, and the part where I had made it without the 2 people who were supposed to help and chose not to. In the back of the room, my phone vibrated with a flood of messages I did not read yet, because I had planned this moment like a person plans a hard climb, and the next step was mine to place. So I handed my phone to Maya and asked her to turn it off, and she did it without a speech, because good friends do not need to be told twice. When we finally left the building, the sidewalk was quiet and the night smelled like exhaust and relief, and there was no one waiting by the curb except a driver the foundation had hired to take honorees back to campus. And for a second, I pictured my parents still at the doors trying to negotiate with rules they had never respected in their own house, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, not rage and not triumph, but a cold kind of peace that comes from knowing the math finally balances, and that every choice on both sides had been priced and paid. In the car, Aaron asked me what the fund meant to me beyond the obvious, and I said it is a receipt. It proves where my loyalty belongs. And it makes sure the next kid who gets told to be understanding about a budget that includes a brother's vacation, but not her degree, will have a number to call and a person to answer. And Aaron nodded like a foreman inspecting a beam and said, "Then we will help you grow it," and I believed her. The next morning, the messages were exactly what you would expect when people who never expected consequences meet them head-on, a stacked deck of apologies that were half confession and half public relations, mixed with thin attempts to fold themselves into my win by calling it a family victory, plus one from Jason that called me vindictive for handing our parents a bill for their behavior in front of strangers. And I typed and deleted 3 drafts before I settled on the only reply that kept my spine straight, which said, "I am finished carrying the weight of your choices. The door to my life is not locked, but it is not revolving, and if you want to move toward it, you will have to walk the same distance I did with the same honesty I used." And then I included the fun link and a single sentence that said, "Put something real in the budget." I sent it once to all 3 and muted the thread. In the weeks that followed, I did not soften my edges, and I did not sharpen them further. I simply kept going. Filed papers for a new mailing address and new emergency contacts and a future where the first phone call in a crisis goes to people who have shown me through action that they can be counted on, and I met with the foundation to draft the scholarship language. And I wrote the line that mattered most to me, that applicants who cannot secure a parent signature due to refusal may apply on their own word and their counselors, because I remember the feeling of being told to wait while a golden child boarded a plane, and I want the next version of me to feel a hand on her back instead of a door in her face. When the first 2 awards were announced and the recipients cried into their sleeves while trying not to, I stood in the back and let the sound of their relief become my celebration, because this, more than the speech or the applause or the locked doors, felt like the final move in a plan I wrote the night I packed that duffel, and the only message I sent to my parents after that was a screenshot of the fund total with a note that said, "Education was not in your budget, and that is fine, because as it turns out, access to me is not in mine," and I walked away without checking whether they read it, because the victory was not making them understand. It was finally living a life they cannot afford to narrate.